Well, welcome everybody to the Inequality and Social Policy Seminar. I'm Chris Winship. I think I know many of you, but for those who don't, I'm a professor in sociology and I'm also on the senior faculty at the Kennedy School. So our seminar series here is part of the Harvard James M. and Catherine D. Stone PhD Scholars Program in the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy. Today, we're most fortunate to have one of the most preeminent scholars of immigration in the world, Professor Richard Alba. And he will be talking about his recent book, The Great Demographic Illusion, which came out from Princeton University Press last year. He is a distinguished professor of sociology at the Graduate Center of the University of New York. And I think he defines himself as both a sociologist and a demographer. And his research interests include race, ethnicity, migration, and urban sociology. He grew up in the Bronx, where many of his interests of his started, and then got his PhD from Columbia. And I think these days, for people like Richard and I, we don't mention what the year is. For many years, he's taught at the State University of New York, and he came back to the city, and particularly the City University of New York, the Graduate Center, in 2008. He has been the vice president of the American Sociological Association and president of the Sociological Research Association. He's had a Guggenheim and been a fellow at Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. He is a member of the National Academy of Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He has many books, including Strangers No More, Blurring the Color Line, Remaking the American Mainstream. Thank you very much, Professor Alba, for coming and speaking to us today.
It's great to be here, Chris, and I want to thank you and Jennifer Hochschild and Maya Sen and Daniel Schneider. I guess I've got all your colleagues who are running the seminar for inviting me. Okay, so obviously, as Chris said, I'm talking about my book, The Great Demographic Illusion. The subtitle of this talk actually is not the same subtitle of the book, but I'm going to focus the talk on the question of how assimilation can still matter in a very diverse, multiracial society like that of 21st century America. So my starting point is going to be questions about how we understand current changes and their implications for the future. And in this respect, a demographic narrative, actually the plural is probably not warranted there, is really important. And sort of in line with the aphorism, demography is destiny, many, many Americans on both sides of the political spectrum believe that a majority-minority America, where whites will be a numerical minority of the population by the mid-century, is inevitable as a result of basically demographic processes such as fertility, migration, mortality. This widespread belief is having a visible impact on our politics. Political scientists pointed to the Trump victory as partly based on this, quote, racial resentment of non-college educated whites. The book by John Sides and his colleagues called Identity Crisis attempted to demonstrate this. In the most recent kind of upsurge of white nationalism and Trumpism, as represented, by the siege of the Capitol building on January 6th, we see the presence of people who have bought into the idea of replacement theory, which is a far right-wing theory, actually originated in Europe, and claims that elites are seeking to replace the natives of Western Europe and North American societies with the with non-white immigrants and their descendants, and sort of linking to this idea of the roiling of politics by this narrative. Social psychologists such as Jennifer Richardson of Yale have shown that many whites react with anxiety and concern when presented with scenarios of this demographic change, and it tends to make them also more conservative in the way they respond to questions about policy and politics. So the idea of a majority-minority image, though, also kind of comports, we could say, with some of the currently popular ideas in the social sciences, and particularly with ideas about white supremacy and therefore with critical race theory. So, the white non-white binary is seen as acritical or the critical societal fault line. In this demographic narrative, the categories don't overlap very much, or at least insofar as they overlap, it's not enough to really matter. They encompass everybody. Everybody is on one or another side of this divide. So the critical race narrative, of course, sees our society as a white supremacist one. But I mean, presumably many who hold to it welcome the majority-minority America of the near future as a society in which white supremacy will be more vulnerable. And presumably there should be many societal ramifications as whites lose their majority status. Now, it's interesting that, and I'll show that the census data that bolster this idea of America have an implicit one-drop rule. But I think also, many social scientists still operate with a one-drop rule, and assuming, therefore, that individuals who come from mixed minority white family backgrounds are generally going to be located on the minority side of this division. And I've had discussions with various colleagues who operate from a critical race theory perspective and argue that this happens because whites refuse to accept them, something that we'll have a chance to look at as we go along. Okay, so as I've implied, census data are really important to this narrative. And certainly they play a very important role in validating the idea that a majority-minority America is inevitable. The Census Bureau regularly produces population projections, and these show, in their most recent version, that by 2045, whites will be a numerical minority of the American population. But they mean whites in what might really be seen as an unusual sense. So the quote here, more than half of all Americans are projected to belong to a minority group in 2045, anything other than non-Hispanic white alone. And for those of you who are not specialists in reading demographic data, let me just unpack that a bit for you. So that means that we have individuals who, yes, they say they're not Hispanic, but they also say that they're the only race that they belong to is the white race. Census Bureau estimates of the current population have also been influential in supporting the majority-minority narrative, particularly focusing on the youth population, which is now seen as a majority-minority population, where whites are a minority and the collective of minorities is the majority. And so, for example, in around the middle of the last decade, the Census Bureau released estimates of the population that said that that babies born in the United States today are in their majority members of minority groups. NPR had babies of color, now the majority, the census says. So let me give you a signal of where I'm going and say that I think this is false. And I'll give you a reason why I think this is false as we move along. Okay, so but to understand a little bit better kind of what the census data look like that are being used to bolster the idea of the majority minority population, let's look at these projections from the Census Bureau from their, I think this is the last series they did in 2017. And so here we have not Hispanic, whoops, sorry, I didn't mean that, not Hispanic, one race, white race. So these are the non-Hispanic white alone in this row. And if we go over here, I hope you can see my cursor, but under 2045, you'll see the figure 49.75. So in 2045, non-Hispanic single race whites are a bare minority of the population. So obviously, you know, Hispanics are being treated as minorities, and here they are. But also, and this is a curious line that we should pay attention to, individuals with two or more races are also being treated as minorities because, of course, the white population is being defined as containing only individuals who say they are white alone. Now, when we look across this this row for two or more races, it doesn't really seem as if the numbers are large enough to really change the sort of the direction of this overall change. In other words, it doesn't seem to really affect the notion that whites will be a minority by the middle of this century. But this may turn out to be a bit deceptive. Most of the people in the two or more races category have a white parent. Okay, so let me raise some concerns about the majority minority narrative. And one is that, you know, we have sort of two bodies of experience, we could say, that can be drawn on for ideas about how new groups will integrate into our society. So sort of one is the experience of African Americans and to some extent Native Americans, who obviously have suffered enormously from racial exclusion. And indeed, the one drop rule was really coined from their experience because individuals of white and black descent until very recently in American history have been largely forced into the African American group by white exclusion. But the other body of experience is the experience of immigrant groups. And of course, this is primarily, not exclusively though, primarily groups that have come to the United States from Europe. These were the very big groups at the early 20th century, like Jews and Italians kind of are the prototypes. And these groups were seen through the early part of the century as questionably integratable or assimilable into American society, but they did in the end assimilate. So on the one hand, we have groups where ethno-racial boundaries have been very rigid. And on the other hand, we have groups where ethno-racial boundaries have been more fluid. And so, you know, when we look at contemporary minorities, they are non-white, but mostly, aside from African Americans, they're of immigrant origin. So in a sense, the question becomes, which principle is going to be more important? Is it more important that they are non-white and therefore like African Americans, or is it more important that they are of immigrant origin and therefore like the once degraded the Jews and Italians who were once viewed as so on the margins of American society? Another complication is that arising from increasing formation of families that span the minority white ethno-racial divide. And so we have to ask, how does this affect the story, demographic story of the majority minority society? So let me point out the really rapid might not be the right word, but certainly the robust surge of intermarriage across lines of race and Hispanic origin. This is from work that the Pew Research Center did and published in 2017. And it was intended to be research on the 50th anniversary of the wonderfully named Loving v. Virginia decision of the Supreme Court that finally threw out the last of the state anti-miscegenation laws. So in 1967, the year of that decision, intermarriage across lines of race was very low, but it has been creeping up, and in 2015, 1/6 of the newlyweds of that year had married across lines of race or Hispanic origin. Now, of course, many families are formed today without benefit of marriage. A lot of children are born out of wedlock. And one might ask, well, do these data carry over? Probably even more strongly, in the sense that it's very likely that some cohabiting couples don't marry because indeed they cross these boundaries and their families object. So I think it's the intermarriage data are not comprehensive, but they're a good indication of the degree of mixing in family formation. So what does this mean about children? Well, so now the previous data that Pew gave us come from census data, but now I'm going to turn to birth certificate data. And birth certificate data have an advantage over census data because we're not restricted to parents who are cohabiting with an infant. And so we can look at all births, and even when the father is not acknowledged, those births are included in the data on which this graph is based. When there's only a mother and no father, I'm counting those infants as not mixed, because my idea of mixed is that individuals who are born into a mixed family setting have, by virtue of their birth, close kinship relations to individuals coming from two or more ethno-racial groups or populations. So in 2017, a little more than 14% of all the births were mixed. Of those mixed births, 75% of them, more than 10%, involved a white parent and a non-white parent, or at least a parent who would be regarded as non-white by the census coding of ethnicity race. Now, interestingly, the biggest group of these mixes is one that gets very little attention. I mean, when people think of those who have come from mixed ethno-racial backgrounds, they probably most frequently think of individuals who have a Black-white parentage, or maybe they think of Asian white parentage. But the really big group has one Hispanic parent and one non-Hispanic white parent. Notice that those are at least half of all of the minority white mixes. And another interesting category is the group of individuals who have a white parent and a racially mixed parent. And in most cases, that racially mixed parent is partly white. And you'll see that there's a lot of marriage by individuals who are mixed minority and white with whites. But okay, so now we know that we have to pay attention to the Hispanic white mixed category because it looms so large in the total population of mixes in contemporary America. Okay, so now we have to think about a bit about census data, and which again, I want to point out has been used to validate the notion that we are inevitably heading toward a mixed minority majority society. And it turns out that the data are really questionable because there are real problems that are baked into both the collection of ethno-racial data and the way they are then coded by the Census Bureau, certainly for purposes of the public presentation of data. So the Census Bureau isn't comfortable with data presentations that place individuals in more than one ethno-racial category. Of course, that would also mean that when we added up the percentages in different categories, that we'd get more than 100%. That's part of the discomfort. And so in the most common public presentation of data, as we saw, individuals who are reported as mixed white and minority are classified as not white. I say that in and of itself creates a problem. In addition, the current format that the Census Bureau uses, and also in the 2020 census, is a two-question format for collecting data about ethnicity and race. So there's one question for Hispanic origin and another question for race. And this makes it impossible for us to identify at least with any accuracy, individuals who are trying to say that they're mixed Hispanic and non-Hispanic. So, for example, if a person has, a white parent, a non-Hispanic white parent, and a Hispanic parent, and says, "Well, I'm Hispanic and white," that person will simply be classified as Hispanic. And the reason for this is actually sensible, and that is that for most people of Hispanic background, their primary identification is with Hispanic origin, and they're required to report a race, but we have very good evidence that their reporting of race doesn't really fit our common understanding of racial categories. So we know that a lot of people who are Hispanic check white as their race, about half do. But that isn't because they necessarily regard themselves as white. They just think, well, this is the category I should use. Some of it has to do, like at the southern border, in communities of Mexican American families that have been present on American soil since before the end of the Mexican American War. This has to do with memories of how they were classified in the treaty that ended the war. They were regarded, according to those treaties, as white. In any event, I mean, these racial reports are not really regardable as a reliable indicator of our ordinary meanings of race. So how does this affect then the growing number of children who come from mixed minority white ethno-racial backgrounds? And I should have said, by the way, when I showed you the birth certificate data, that the number of children, babies born from mixed with mixed family backgrounds has been rising steadily, not sharply necessarily, but steadily. And so a lot of the mixed Americans are actually children. By the way, in census projections, this is even more true because the projections imply even further mixing between now and 2045. Well, of course, children are not telling us how they identify. They are if their parents are reporting their ethno-racial backgrounds to the Census Bureau. And it's not surprising that in the great majority, and I mean, I've looked at the data, in the great majority, parents of mixed parents from two different groups report their children as mixed because they want to honor, if you will, both sides of their children's family backgrounds. So that means then that the children are going to be regarded as non-white. by the way the census classifies mixed individuals in public data. There's a further problem, and I know this is going a bit into the weeds, but I think it's worth it because we have to understand how problematic the census data are in conveying to us how the society is changing, other than saying it's becoming a lot more diverse. That's true. Okay, but so the census population projections treat the category memberships of individuals as fixed, not things that may vary over time. And indeed, we'll see this assumption really does not work in the 21st century. And the census projections are encountering individuals, mixed individuals, mostly when they are children, either children who currently exist in families or children who are going to be born in the future. So that means that the projections automatically classify the great majority of mixed individuals as on the non-white side of the minority white binary divide. Okay, so that of course raises the question, well, how should we think about mixed family backgrounds in the 21st century? And obviously we have a history, certainly with regard to African Americans, of the one drop rule. That is to say that individuals who have any noticeable minority origin are pressured to classify themselves with their minority background. But I think that the data are convincing that mixed origins have a status in the 21st century that they did not clearly have in the 20th century and before. And the Census Bureau deserves some credit here because the decision to, in 2000, allow multiple race reports by individuals has contributed certainly to bringing new attention to people coming from mixed family backgrounds. But in addition, and I'll come back to this point later on, we know from analyses that have matched individuals across censuses, like between the 2000 census and the 2010 census, that individuals who have mixed backgrounds have unusually fluid identities. That is to say that their identities have a very high likelihood of changing between two censuses, and so that they present themselves both as mixed individuals, but also as members of single categories out of that mixture. Okay, now at this point, to sort of prepare the way for what's coming, I want to introduce a little bit of assimilation theory here. And assimilation, as I use the term, is really not equatable with the kind of assimilation ideas that we've inherited from some of the canonical authors like Milton Gordon, who wrote his book on assimilation in 1964. And he presented assimilation as a largely one-way process. Minorities give up, you could say, their culture to acquire the culture of the ethnic core of American society. That was, of course, people from Northern and Western Europe, especially from the British Isles at the time that he was writing. And he also presented assimilation as the absorption of one group into another, which would imply for the contemporary period that for immigrant minorities to assimilate, they'd have to become white. And that just doesn't make sense. So, Victor Nie and I wrote a book called Remaking the American Mainstream in 2003, and we defined assimilation there as the decline of an ethno-racial distinction or an ethno-racial boundary. Decline meaning that for some individuals, or maybe for the entire group, um, that ethno-racial distinction comes to have less and less of a role in their lives. It's less and less relevant to the various social contexts in which they find themselves, and presumably it could at some point disappear, or maybe disappearance here would mean what the mid 20th century Stanley Edgar Hyman said when he asked, "What does being Jewish mean to you?" And he said, "Well, it means the occasional midnight yearning for a pastrami sandwich." But it doesn't have to contract that far. And so this definition does not require the erasure of ethno-racial identity, nor the disappearance of all of the cultural and social traits associated with an ethno-racial background. I believe that this definition or concept makes sense when we look at the experiences that have been most important for thinking about assimilation. And in particular, the period after World War II, when Catholics, ethnic Catholics and Jews um, entered the mainstream in massive numbers, is a kind of canonical experience that is drawn on in various ways. I mean, in critical race theory, it's drawn on because the claim is that they became white and therefore they could participate in a white dominated mainstream. But I'm going to emphasize something quite different, and that is that they didn't cease to become Catholics and Jews when they entered what had previously defined itself as a white Protestant mainstream society. Not only did they not cease to become Catholics and Jews, but they even, as they were entering the mainstream, they asserted ethnic distinctiveness to, not to an extreme degree, but to various muted degrees. So most visible in the rise of hyphenated identities like Italian American or Irish American, which had been frowned on by the white Protestant mainstream in the first part of the 20th century. Um, so, okay, so as I said, assimilation in the 21st century need not mean becoming white. And instead, as the Alba and Nee argue, a more useful conception of assimilation is that it means entry into the mainstream of the society, where, by definition, the role of ethno-racial origins in determining status and in shaping cross-group interactions is diminished. In the new book, I use the term decategorization. And of course, by virtue of their social power, most whites are going to be located in the mainstream society. So assimilation can make the mainstream more diverse. It did that in the middle of the 20th century, when the identity of the mainstream went from being white Protestant to being white Judeo-Christian. The term Judeo-Christian, by the way, being invented during the World War II experience, but became a common shorthand for understanding the nature of the mainstream society. Actually popularized, those of you who've studied the sociology of religion, there was a very famous book published in the 1950s by the sociologist Will Herberg called Protestant Catholic Jew, which advanced this thesis of now the mainstream was a religiously diverse one. Okay, whoops, wait. Okay, so and what now we're sort of pivoting here, and I'm going to be looking at what we know about the mixed minority white population. And it's, I'm going to say that I'm using this population because it's a very good window into ongoing assimilation processes. Focusing on it doesn't mean that I think that these processes are irrelevant to others, but just this is a very clear, this offers some very clear patterns. And we have a fair amount of data, although, we could always use a lot more. Um, and given this, that the data are to some extent sparse, I'm going to argue we should look for pieces that fit together, that lock in the way that jigsaw puzzle pieces lock. And in the book, I've drawn a lot of data, not all of which I'm going to present here, obviously, but that includes the birth certificate data, census data about the families of mixed children, and also about young adults who claim to come from mixed backgrounds. We have surveys, including especially the Pew Survey of Multiracial Americans and the Pew Survey of Hispanic Identity are both very relevant. Add health data and a limited number of ethnographic studies. And the one that I drawn, especially in the book, is by a young sociologist named Hephzibah Strimick Powell, and I recommend her book, which was her doctoral dissertation, to you. So the argument is going to be this, that most mixed Americans appear to be moving into the mainstream part of society. But there is an exception. It's a hugely important exception, and that is that individuals who have Black-white parentage have experiences that are still very strongly marked by racism, and they are not easily seen as moving into the mainstream. Okay, so the first point is that kids who are growing up in mixed minority white families are typically better off than are kids growing up in the equivalent minority families. And for example, if you look, so this is these lines give the college education of the parents. The darker parts of the bars are indicate parents who both have a BA. And you'll notice immediately that what sticks out are the Asian parents up here, whoops, there, and then also the Asian white parents. And you'll see that they're actually, in terms of their parental education levels, a bit better off than the children growing up with two Asian parents, even though those children are also very highly educated, more educated than children growing up with two white parents, whom you can see up here. Also considerably better off are children growing up with a Hispanic parent and a non-Hispanic white parent. The education levels of their parents are far better than is the case when there are two Hispanic parents, where I'm pointing the cursor now, but they're not this, they don't really reach the level of education that is found in the typical white family, which is up here. Very similar to the white Hispanic parents are the white mixed parents, where one parent is non-Hispanic white and the other parent is mixed. So they're better off than minorities in general, but not as well off as the white parents. The least well off among the mixed children are the children who come from mixed Black-white families. And right here is the more common combination of a Black father and a white mother. And you can see that that's just a little bit ahead of the parental levels when both parents are Black. By the way, these data don't come from the census, which would be limiting because it would limit us to parents, again, who cohabit, who are mostly married. So these come from the birth certificate data. Okay, so mixed minority white kids tend to grow up in neighborhoods where they are exposed to white kids, not only to white kids, but to white kids. And and the data that I present in the book about their neighborhood locations are not that convincing, actually, in my opinion. So here I'm resorting to friendship data when they are adolescents as an indicator of the kinds of social milieus in which they are growing up. And the basic story, this comes from the book, the recent book by Grace Kao and others. And the basic story here is that um, mixed kids are more likely to choose white friends than are the equivalent minority kids. For Asian whites and Hispanic whites, it's a big gap. For Black whites, there is a gap, but it's not nearly as big. So, so this says that the top line, Asian white children are 70% of them, when as adolescents, choose a white best friend, and only 11% choose an Asian best friend. And of course, that's very different from the friendship choices made by kids growing up in Asian only families. And you can see that white children are also somewhat more likely to choose white friends, but really, you know, it's not a very large number. So mostly they choose Black friends, reflecting, in fact, the way they are, you know, they are treated. And so Hispanic white here does not mean necessarily mixed. The book doesn't present the data for the children of a Hispanic parent and a white parent. So I'm using the category of Hispanic racially white as likely to contain those mixed children. And you can see that 57% of the young people in that category choose white friends. Another 13% choose Hispanic white friends. The book doesn't tell us what percent choose Hispanic friends, so I've had to leave that blank. But this is a big difference from Hispanic kids overall, who only 30% of whom choose white friends. Okay, so mixed individuals have better educational outcomes than do people from the equivalent minority background. So I need to say something here, and that is that the reporting of mixed backgrounds in the census is selective, and I'll show that clearly in a little while. So to concoct this table, I've drawn on what I call expanded identifications of people from mixed backgrounds, and that's brought into play the ancestry data that exist in the American Community Survey. So for example, an individual can be Asian and white when that individual says on the race question they are Asian and white, or when that individual says on the Asian that they're Asian on the race question, but indicates a European ancestry on the ancestry question, or that person says white on the race question, but indicates an Asian ancestry on the ancestry question. So I've tried to overcome to some extent the selectivity in reporting mixed origins by drawing on the ancestry data. In any event, let's just look here at the Hispanic.
Richard, we need to wrap up fairly soon.
Okay, then I'm going to just say here, I'll just use the Hispanic white category. So you can see that these are men, by the way, ages 25 to 39. And you can see that the Hispanic whites are much more likely to have a college education than are people coming from Hispanic only backgrounds. And they're not that far behind whites, although they are somewhat. And, you know, we can go through this, and even Black whites are significantly better off than young people coming from a Black only family. Okay, so we'll skip here and then one more after that, and I'll wrap it up. So we also can see from census data that mixed individuals frequently marry whites. So for instance, Asian whites, this is men, this is women. So roughly 2/3 of individuals from Asian white backgrounds marry whites. And the numbers are much smaller for those who marry individuals coming from an Asian-only background. People who have Hispanic Anglo or Hispanic white backgrounds are also very likely to marry whites. The majority do, although here there are larger numbers of who marry individuals with a Hispanic or mixed Hispanic background. And even though Black whites are in many ways the victims of discrimination, you can see that they have relatively high rates of marriage to whites. Relatively high meaning if we compare them to Black-only individuals. Okay, so here comes the fluidity of the identities of mixed individuals. And I think the most convincing evidence of this really comes from census data and from the studies that have been done by matching individuals between different census data sets. So Carolyn Liebler and her colleagues published a paper in Demography in 2017, arguing or showing that if individuals say they are Asian and white in one census, the probability is only about a third that they will say they're Asian and white in the other census. And the great majority of the individuals who don't report as mixed Asian and white in the other census choose either white or Asian as the way to report themselves. And for Asian whites, they choose white more frequently than they choose Asian. On the other hand, Black-white individuals are also very inconsistent, but they're much more likely to report in the other census a Black-only response than a white-only response. Now, we also have, it's not quite the same, but we also have some data for Latinos that show a great deal of inconsistency, presumably for people who come from mixed backgrounds. So in this case, the census group matched across 2 censuses plus 1 ACS data that allows them to bring in the ancestry question. And you can, more than a fifth of US born Hispanics do not report consistently as Hispanic. When they don't report as Hispanic, about 80% of them appear as non-Hispanic and white. These are individuals who mostly report some European ancestry. And this is consistent with what we have from the Pew survey of Hispanic identity, which also shows over generations a movement away from Hispanic identity. Okay, so we have to wrap up, so I'm sorry, I'm going to have to skip a bit. This is also interesting. I hope you'll read the book. Let me just come to the end. So some final words. I can't say that the US will not become a majority minority society where whites are a minority of the population. But I think that if it does become that, it will not look like what we currently imagine it to be. And that is because there is a very, there's a robust process of assimilation that is bringing substantial numbers of the descendants of the post-1965 immigrants into what is now a white dominated mainstream, but is going to destined to become a much more diverse mainstream. I think that this has some implications for social science because I think that some of the more popular theories among young social scientists at the moment are ones that are very comportable with the idea of the majority minority society, which really sees American society as divided by a binary between minority and white. And I think we need, I'm not here to say that those theories should be rejected, but simply to say they need to be complemented by assimilation ideas if social scientists are going to be able to comprehend the changes that are now clearly taking place and are going to shape the contours of ethnicity and race by the middle of the century. And finally, I think the notion that there is an inevitable demography that is going to produce a society of a certain type by the middle of the century really should be rejected. I mean, uh, our future is far more indeterminate than the notion of an ineluctable set of demographic forces implies. And the key, I think, lies in the social locations of upwardly mobile Americans with some minority parentage. And those locations are going to be determined largely by sociological forces, by the opportunities that are open to those young people, and by the willingness, especially of white Americans, to accept them into their milieu. So I'll stop here, and I'm happy to take questions. And I'm sorry if I went on and on.
Thank you very much, Richard. So I do want to open the floor to questions. Why don't we start with Carl Poser, who's put quite a few questions and comments into the chat. Carl?
I really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
I do a lot of work on inequality, exploring that and advocating for the bottom 50%. I chose the bottom 50%.
Sure, that's
A lot
fine.
of people in Washington. It's a motley group. So I get stuck with the Trumpers and people of color and all this. But I'm thinking that, two questions. To what degree does our classification system that's been inherited, from the historical past, involving white and black, contribute to continuing racism and classifying people in their consciousness this way? Secondly, and I think with all the work on inequality showing that there's an underclass, and I'm also going to refer to Isabel Wilkerson's book Caste. Are we heading for a society where there's going to be wealth and income are separating more, but the new underclass, is it going to be less defined by race and more by these opportunities that you talk about? Those are my questions.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure if I can answer them definitively. What I can say is that I agree that economic inequality is a big problem. So a part of the talk that I didn't get to sort of indicates that the degree of assimilation, the extent, the magnitude of assimilation today is probably a lot less than it was in the middle of the 20th century. Today, its nature is largely demographic. As the baby boom is retiring, minorities are needed to replace them, including in high level jobs. But that still leaves a lot of people out. And you're right, it's both whites and minorities. And so there's a chapter in the book where I take up social policies that could be used to expand assimilation. And one category of social policy is social policies to address inequality. Nothing I say there would surprise you. It's the usual thing to kind of remediate the degree of economic inequality and particularly of wealth in American society. I can't say whether mobility will become, to the bottom part of our society, will become so limited that we can say that we have this large underclass that is no longer defined by race. I think that today it's still the case that poor African Americans are a lot worse off than working class whites. So.
Tony Bro had a question. I'll read it to you. How much of the 39% Hispanic white birth certificate data is the result of the data collection format where the white parent identified resulted from answering the race question and not answering the Hispanic/non-Hispanic item, where the Hispanic parent answered the Hispanic non-Hispanic item?
I don't know. That's a really technical question. I don't know.
Okay, well, that's a short
I mean,
answer.
all I can say is that to classify somebody in that category, one parent had to be classified as non-Hispanic white and the other as Hispanic of whatever race. That's all, that's the definition.
Question from Christina Hong, if you pronounce it right. To what extent does assimilation contribute to the model minority myth?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think certainly that it's less a question of what assimilation does than what people who want to believe in assimilation uh, say. So I think that, you know, for those who want to believe that American society um, is not a white supremacist society that automatically excludes people who are not white, there's a lot of attractiveness to the model minority theory, which says that if you have the right, you know, if you have the right kind of qualities and you're non-white, you can still make it in American society.
Okay. From Sandy Jenks, how would you revise the census in the future? How would you count white in the future?
Okay. So I think actually the Census Bureau has proposed a decent question, and it tested it in 2015. And so it intended to replace the two-question format with a single integrated question in which Hispanic was treated as a category like the racial categories. And I'm persuaded from the tests that the Census Bureau performed in 2015 that that question worked pretty well and would help identify the people who are both Hispanic and non-Hispanic something else. I think that would be a big improvement. I think that the Census Bureau, though, needs to find a way to honor, if you will, to respect the choices that people make to report themselves into categories. I find that the public presentations of data that sideline mixed individuals into the minority category are deeply misleading. And I also think the Census Bureau should stop making projections for a bit, at least ethno-racial projections, because it doesn't have really had a deal yet with the mixed Americans.
Jennifer Hochschild?
Hi, Jennifer.
Hello, Richard. I was been walking around my study wanting to hold up your book, which is sitting on my to read immediately pile, but
Okay.
I can't find it. Anyway, this is terrific. Thank you very much. So my question has to do with the comparison with the turn of the 20th century immigrant
Yes,
incorporation,
sure.
assimilation of the type that you obviously know more about than any of the rest of us in this room. And it's the 1924 Immigration Act.
Yes.
Right, that's the big question. To
Yeah.
what degree
Yeah.
you think counterfactually what would have happened with that population had there not been that act, or think contemporarily, will Latinos, mixed race people, whatever the category is that you're talking about, be able to follow that same trajectory absent a cutoff of immigration? You see the point of the question. How
I
much,
do see the question. Yes,
What-
yes.
what role did that act play in
Yeah.
everything that followed?
Yeah, okay. I mean, I think it had some role. It certainly, I mean, you know, among groups like the Italians, it produced a kind of generational sequencing that corresponded with age, you know, and so it led people to see the most, people growing up in Italian American families saw the most Italian members of their families as older members of the first generation. They were more American. It had some effect. I don't want to overemphasize that, though, because it certainly would have been true that under another set of circumstances, we're the post World War II society, not a society of enormous prosperity because of the Americans, the United States position in the world economy. Were it not a society which expanded its educational system, you know, a higher educational system enormously in a short period of time, creating an opportunity for mobility, I think the assimilation we're talking about would not have happened. So I don't see the closing of the gate as definitive for this. So should we have a similar, I mean, what would happen if we had a similar act today? I don't know. I think, though, that, as I said to an earlier question, the assimilation we're talking about here is much more limited and is really the product of a kind of demographic synchronization between the retirement of the heavily white, well-placed baby boom and the rise of young cohorts to the ages of work life. And these cohorts are, of course, far more diverse. And for example, if we take college graduates today and we look at who is present among them, the number of whites is declining. The white college graduates cannot replace the number of young white college graduates cannot replace the white college graduates who are leaving the workforce as part of the baby boom. So there's a kind of demographic necessity that is pushing this, but that will end soon. Once the baby boom retires, that contribution to change is gone. So I'm trying to say, I guess, in a very long-winded way, that I think the magnitude is really different today, and it's lower, it's less, and we need to seek social policy ways of enhancing it to open up opportunity to move into the mainstream to a broader set of people.
So I don't see any more questions, and we're over time. So thank you, Richard. If people can unmute and give him a hand, fine.
Okay.
Hear a lot of silent hands clapping. Terrific talk.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Great to be here, and great to see so many friends. Thank you.